Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Forrest Whiting.
And I'm Amien Essif.
Over the last few years, China has been involved in extensive island building across the South China Sea in disputed waters that other countries also lay claim to. This month, China said it had seized another sandbank. The Philippines says it's in their waters and it belongs to them. So this week, we're asking from Taiwan to the Philippines, is China making its move while the world is distracted?
So there's plenty to discuss here, and as always, we're going to get your comments and questions. Just put them in the live chat that's going on right now, and we'll try to get to that as much as possible. And we've already had some questions and comments on our community post, which we always put up 24 hours before we go live. We have Fame Files X saying one sandbank at a time. That's how China rewrites the map while the world argues over tariffs. We've also had one critical comment so far. Gaspardini says, imagine being so obsessed with Trump that you need to start a title about China and Philippines with his name. But I think that brings up a relevant point, which is how much does the re-election of Trump have to do with what we see in the waters of the South China Sea happening right now? And then I also thought this was interesting from Heydarian, at Heydarian. Are we going to ignore the fact that there's been recent joint military exercise between the U.S. and the Philippines and live fire drills being conducted, which has been happening over the past couple of weeks there. So getting in again into the role of the U.S.
And absolutely, we will not be ignoring that. We will be talking about that a little bit later. We'll be putting all your comments, all your questions that you pop into the chat to our experts who you'll meet a little bit later in the stream. They include author and social scientist Richard Heydarian, who will be joining us from Manila in the Philippines. We'll also have our very own Melissa Chan, who is in Taiwan. She'll be with us a little bit later. And in the studio, we have our very own China analyst, Clifford Coonan. We really can't do these streams without you, Clifford, I think is the opinion here. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll be speaking to you in just a moment.
And also around the table, we have Dustin Hemmerlein, our reporter here. He's going to be breaking this down for us, kind of giving us a little introduction to what's been going on, especially since the last time we did a show about the tensions in the South China Sea. So say hello, Dustin.
Hello, Dustin.
And we also have Pablo Foley Elias, who's going to be taking care of the chat today. So if you have any questions, you can direct it directly at Pablo, and he's going to try to answer your questions. He also has a poll going on, don't you?
That's right, Amien, and hi to all our viewers around the world. So our question this week is China taking advantage of a distracted US? You've got four options. Yes, by expanding control. Yes, by testing red lines. No change to Beijing's policy is your third option. And no, the US is still engaged. So please do vote in the poll. And of course, send in your questions and comments throughout the show today. And I'll, of course, get them over to Amien. And I'll also be reading them out throughout the show too. So thanks for watching, guys.
Thanks, Pablo. And as he says, do please vote in that poll, as well as putting your comments and your questions in the chat as we go along. OK, Clifford, let's turn to you first of all. We know that China has been involved in this island building in the South China Sea for some years now. And just to get an idea of how far China has got with some of that, we've got some footage which we can show you of Subi Reef in the Spratly Islands. Now, this aerial footage was taken by a Philippine patrol and shows a Chinese military base that's been built on what was just over 10 years ago, a sandbank pretty much. Clifford, what more can you tell us about this and other reefs like it that China has militarized?
I think if you look at it, the sheer size of it is incredible. I mean, this started life as a spit of sand in the middle of the Spratlys. The Spratlys themselves are tiny. These are really, you know, there's very, very little there. They're quite spread apart. And then this incredible process of construction has gone on there. I mean, you can see there's these Chinese-style villas in there. All these, it looks like mainland China. It's incredible. You know, it looks like Hainan Island. In miniature. It's got a runway. Reportedly, it's got missile silos for land-to-air missiles. I mean, this is a staging post And if you get enough of these in a chain, you can control the whole region. So it's a massive development.
Who are these houses for, though? Is it all for military? I mean, kind of when I first saw this video, I thought kind of gave me the itch to go on vacation. It looked like something out of the coast of Florida or something, where you could go to a 5-star hotel and sit on the beach all day drinking
It does. It looks like a holiday island,
Yeah.
A bit of a cross between a Bond villain lair, James Bond villain's lair, and a holiday island. I mean, and there's been talk that there will eventually be tourism applications for this. I mean, it's just, I just find the scale of it. Look at that runway, and those runways can land. You can land heavy military aircraft there. It's really incredible.
But for now, you would say that those houses are for military personnel?
I would say it's military personnel and government personnel.
Right. Just to clarify, it's a reef that's obviously claimed by China, but also other countries, Vietnam, the Philippines,
Brunei,
Taiwan, maybe?
Taiwan, yeah. So so everyone wants it, but the thing is that this has been going on quietly for years. I remember years ago in the 2000s meeting a naval attaché from one of the Western embassies, and he said, it's great being here in Beijing, and you got the Great Wall. He says, but I've been spending a lot of my time looking at the Great Wall of Sand, and because they were getting sand from all over. And bringing it and creating these islands, literally making islands. It's just an astonishing program. And while we do have flashpoints like we've had in recent days, and every couple of years there's flashpoints, but this has been going on constantly now for decades. And it's just, and you have this sort of political debate going on at the top, and China's saying, they're for navigation purposes, they're for fishing, they're for, or for environmental protection, which is pretty ironic given that I don't think there's too much coral that survived that building procedure there. And all the other nations, and they've been fighting it out in the International Maritime Court in The Hague, which says that these islands do belong to the Philippines. But China is simply ignoring it. So, and it's going to keep pushing and pushing until eventually, because a lot of these international institutions now are focused on what China wants, and China is working steadily to build influence in these international institutions. So I imagine at some point it's going to be that they're going to come up with something where basically China gets what it wants.
Yeah. Clifford, thanks very much. Dustin, I want to turn to you because we have had this latest incident that we've all been alluding to. But just with that Subi reef, we've shown the pictures that we said were taken by the Filipino patrol, but we can actually see it, can't we?
Yes, if you guys want to have a look at my screen, I can share the Subi Reef satellite picture with you. And we can actually share the coordinates of this as well in the chat. So if you want to have a look, there's 3 islands. I'm going to talk about the other 2 in a moment. And the Subi Reef is number 1. And if I zoom in on it, you can actually kind of see what we just saw in the video. I'm assuming the plane did fly kind of here, right? And then you see all these villas, what Clifford just talked about, and then the video ends on showing us the runway, which is over here. And this island is just, basically a big military base, right, that was built from nothing. I can show you one thing here. If there's a history function in Google Earth, and if you go back, you can actually see what this looked like a long time ago. Let me just do this really quick so you can do this. Oh, this is the oldest one. And this is 2005. And if I then move, right, you can see the building process here now in 2015. 2016, it's almost built. And then over time, becomes like what it is now. So yeah, that's just, if you want to follow along at home, play with that. It's really interesting to see this being built. But the thing that made us think a different kind of island, or maybe it's more of a rock in the sea, you can see it up here, Sandy Cape. That's what made us think we should pick up this topic this week. Because there was a kind of an incident. If I zoom in, you will see this little patch of sand. I need to zoom in really close because it's not big at all. This is Sandy Cape.
It's literally.
And what happened on Sandy Cape was earlier this month, Chinese soldiers, we only know it from CCTV, from Chinese television. There were pictures released, this picture released of Chinese soldiers raising a Chinese flag on Sandy Cape. And that's like special because like it's a very small patch of land. Like it's only 200, I think, square meters, so bigger than my apartment, but still very small for like an island. Most people would say it's more like an above water rock in the ocean. And they raised this flag, and I think the phrase they used was people who were there exercised the sovereign jurisdiction of China on this island by raising the flag, which led to the Philippines reacting to it. I think the Chinese soldiers left on Sunday, and days after, we can see that here, the Philippines sent their own expedition to the island to, I'm waiting, yeah, this is them, like, getting on shore and like, entering the island. As you can see, it's really, really small. Like, if you look at the size of those people, it's not a big island. And then, yeah, they raised their own flag. And which shows you, right, like how contested this like super small piece of land basically is, right? And it's kind of funny that I think, like, if I look from it from afar, it's like, oh yeah, like, why would you argue about this like super small island and then raise your flag there and be like, no, this is our island. And then of course the Philippines come in and like, no, it's our island. And the reason for that is, if I zoom out, I can show you that Sandy Cay, this super small island, is right in the middle between. Down here on the bottom left, you see what we just looked at, Subi, the Subi Reef, and over here is called the T2 Island, or Payasa Island. That's a different name for it, and that's owned by the Philippines. And that's kind of showing you what the whole conflict is about, right? Like each one of those little islands is another small claim to claim some land in the South China Sea. And what I also want to say is the South China Sea, that's what we often use as a term. The Philippines call it the West Philippine Sea. And then it has a different, they have a different map for it, right? And then, which, yeah, basically supports their claim to this part of the ocean. And I want to show you guys one last thing, which is the maritime traffic around it. And so, this looks different. I'm going to give you the lay of the land, or maybe lay of the sea. Down here, you can see Subi Reef, and up here is T2 Island. And then here, where all the ships are, that's about where Sandy Cay is.
Something's going on
if we click on those ships, you will see like most of them are labeled as like fishing ships and stuff. But yeah, there's lots of talk about these ships being actual military vessels and trying to lay like a Chinese claim around the island. Yeah,
and are those ships that are not just Chinese but also Filipino ships as well?
I counted
most of them.
like 25.
I think every ship I clicked on was a Chinese ship.
There was 25 Chinese, and then you can kind of see behind the Philippine-administered island, the one where they've built a base. There was like 2 or 3 Filipino ships.
Right, that must be. Oh yeah, that should be here.
What do you make of that, Clifford?
I think another function they have is that they do exploration. There's another theory why China is doing this, as well as the strategic political argument, is that there's a lot of resources in the area, natural resources, oil and gas, and so they're also exploring for that there. I think there's an interesting thing. Apparently, Sandy Cay has strategic value because international law grants it a territorial sea, which means that there's a 12 nautical mile radius, which means that if they did start building on it, it would give them a waterway. It would give them access as well. It's about, even within international law, that they could then use it as a real thoroughfare.
Let me show you guys. I actually mapped this out in my little Google Earth project here, where you can see kind of what it looks like. So I just did this. Of course, this is not official, right? I didn't like make an official measurement. I can't officially claim anything here. But those 12 nautical miles, this yellow line is about 12 nautical miles long. And you can see like Sandy Cay, if you made a circle out of that line, that's kind of what they would reach with that claim. And interestingly, the T2 Island is, of course, in that circle. But in practice, a court will have to decide what happens here, right? Like, you can always have all kinds of claims with this international law. And of course, it happens all the time that, like, a theoretical claim that's given by this UN charter, which is called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, yet there's all the time there's a claim that's like difficult or needs to be resolved by a court. That's nothing new.
Let's just pause it there because I do want to bring in our next guest. Richard Heydarian hello, Richard, has many talents, and actually it's difficult to introduce him because he's an author, a columnist, a political scientist, a podcaster, I think a security analyst as well, possibly. I'm just adding that, Richard.
Yeah, just a couple of books on the South China Sea and probably 1,000 articles on it.
There we go.
Yeah,
So
nothing major.
So let's just say he knows his stuff. Richard, thanks so much for joining us because we actually had you on News Desk a year ago, so it's really great to have you back. You've seen what we've been talking about, particularly about Sandy Cay. My question to you then, just to start, is what did you make of that Chinese move then to claim that tiny sandbank in the middle of the South China Sea? Is this something that all about, was this kind of a media presentation because it was Chinese state television that broadcast it?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, many people raised their eyebrows, including yours truly, when I think was it the Financial Times that jumped the gun and said, China seizes supposed territory and all. I think we have to be clear about the facts here. First of all, as far as the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award is concerned, based on Article 287, Annex 7 of the UNCLOS, that was a compulsory arbitration. It was final and binding, whether China wanted to engage it or not. Now, there it's very clear that the Tito Island, or what the Filipinos call Pag-asa or Hope Island, that is a rock. That is a territory that, can project its own territorial sea. But it's not a full-fledged island that can, project its own exclusive economic zone. Having said that, the importance of Sandy Cay is that, until recently, it was, low tide elevation. In fact, there are three parts to the Sandy Cay. There's Sandy Cay 3, 2, 1. And it's next to the Subi Reef, which is occupied and reclaimed by China. But the Sandy Cay, especially the latter part, is within around 2 nautical miles of the Pag-asa Island or Tito Island. So in international law, if you have a low tide elevation within the territorial sea of a rock or a territory, it can bump out or expand your territorial sea. So if it's within 2 nautical miles of the Tito Islands territorial sea, that means the Philippines can project a 14 nautical mile territorial sea. But we know also it's around 14 nautical miles away from nearby Subi Reef, which is occupied by the Chinese. But the last time I checked, if you look at the 2016 ruling, very few land features in the area were actually ruled as an rock, as a territory, as a rock that can project its own territory. I'm not sure Subi Reef falls there. I think Scarborough is. I think the Tito is. But most of the features there are low tide elevation. Now, what's interesting with the Sandy Cay is that because China did reclamation activities in the Subi Reef and all, it created environmental degradation. Coral reefs were destroyed. It created certain sand formation. So as a result of China's illegal reclamation activities, which is not in consonance with international law, suddenly now you have Sandy Cay going from a low tide elevation into some sort of a high tide elevation. So back in the day, it was only you could only see it around few months of the year. But now, because of all of that washed over sand and, coral reefs and all destroyed by the Chinese, it's now kind of its own territory. So now suddenly you're in this situation whereby the Filipinos are just 2 nautical miles away from this feature that used to be mostly underwater, but now it's staring them in the eyes. And then the Chinese, who already occupied and reclaimed the nearby Subi Reef, are trying to come in there. But last time I checked, I think what happened here is that there's no, final occupation of that by either side. The one part of the Sandy Cay Reef, part 3, is very close. Yeah. Probably within a nautical mile or so of the Pag-asa Island, where the Philippines has actually more than 100 people, including citizens and people. So I think what happened there is that the Chinese just took, for the gram, some of their Coast Guard folks took a picture and suddenly, they made a headline out of it that we took over it. But the Filipinos were soon also there and doing something for the gram. But so far, it looks like both sides are trying to avoid a direct confrontation on this. But for around 7 years, Sandy Cay has been at the heart of a kind of a boiling tension between the two sides, but nowhere close to the kind of territorial tensions and disputes we see over Scarborough Shoal and of course, more recently and potentially violently over the second Thomas Shoal, which we can discuss also.
Let me just, Carolina...
Sorry, just before we go on, can we just be great while we're talking about this, if we can just bring that map up again, so that just as we're talking about it, it would be great on Dustin's... There we go. Okay, great. Yeah, just so that we can see what we're talking about. So I know we talked about it earlier, but just makes a bit more sense of the territory.
Yeah, one of our regular viewers, Carolina Vilena, said that China did not recognize that order or decision in favor of the 9-dash line. That's China's territorial, supposed historical territorial claim to most of the South China Sea. What I want to know is because it's very complicated to understand maritime law, and I thought your explanation was very good, but I want to just see if I understood it right and maybe break it down just a little bit for viewers who are not up to speed on what's happening here. Basically, when you make claims according to maritime law, the best claim that you have is that, okay, directly off our coastal waters of our mainland, wherever that is, if you're Philippines, then that is the largest connected islands, and China would be the coast of mainland China. If you say, okay, this is our mainland, everything off this coast, these waters are our waters. And then you have this 200 nautical mile economic zone where you can't really say, if somebody else has an island that historically belongs to them within those waters, you can't kick them off that island, obviously, if they have a historical claim to it. But you can say that what happens around this area, we have economic claim to use these waters. And the problem there is, though, if China takes these small islands that basically don't have a claim themselves because they're just little rocks sticking out of the water, if they turn them into an island that then they put people on it and basically establish a presence there, then it's going to be a lot harder in the future for any court to say, well, these people have to be kicked off because that's just a rock in the water. Because once they build it out into a full-fledged island, then they might have some kind of, maybe not standing legal claim to it, but at least it would be a lot harder to expel them from that area.
Well, they say, in international law, possession is like 3/4 of the game, right? So continuous and effective control of a territory, a disputed territory, always strengthens your position, except what we're talking about here are not naturally formed land features. We're talking about, low tide elevations, basically nothingness, turned into a full-fledged military island, right? So from the perspective of international law, we had a 2016 ruling that, despite, no matter how big China makes these land features into like gigantic military facilities, what the court looked at was what was its natural formation, its original formation, and based on that, made decisions. So, for instance, the Philippines wanted the Pag-asa or Tito Island to be, ruled as a full-fledged island that can generate its own exclusive economic zone of around 200 nautical miles. But for you to qualify for that in international law, you should be able to support human habitation independently, meaning you have to have your water source, food resources. So, for instance, the Taiwanese were also not happy with the 2016 ruling because the Taiping Island, which is controlled by or Ito-Aba, which is controlled by the Taiwanese, they claim there is a water source there, but based on international law, the ruling was that, no, it's just a rock that can at most generate 12 nautical miles territorial sea. The problem we see here is that, remember, it's not just Philippines which is having a problem with China. The closest by full-fledged internationally recognized Chinese island is Hainan province. I've been there. It's a full-fledged island. No one is questioning China's exclusive economic zone there. But the features we're talking about are around 800 nautical miles away from the shores of Hainan, while they're like 200 nautical miles, 100 plus nautical miles away from a couple of Southeast Asian countries. So the reason why we're having a lot of this dispute is not because of the Philippines or Malaysia or Vietnam, it's because China is claiming 85% of the South China Sea basin and a huge number of the land features, including land features that they turn from low tide elevations with no claims to territory into full-fledged islands, which last time I checked, still doesn't qualify them as an island. But you're absolutely right. In operational military terms, it has implication. Having said that, there are a lot of studies coming out of China, including by their military experts, saying that because of climate change and because of very tough conditions, it's not easy also sustaining human habitation on a couple of these islands. And all we know, if there's one thing good that can come out of climate change, is that all of these fake islands, maybe even disputed islands, will be underwater in the coming decades or so. So on the surface, you're absolutely right. Operationally, if the Chinese put weapon systems, aircrafts there, our worst case scenario was this, right? That not only China creates fake islands over nothingness, but that China creates a whole network of military bases and airstrips, and then from there create an air defense identification zone and effectively an exclusion zone, whereby no one can pass the area, aircrafts, warship, without de facto recognition of China's claim to ownership of the entire area. But as we speak, and this is the understanding I have with the Chinese, is that they're still not absolutely clear what is that 9-dash line, what are the exact coordinates, how far they're willing to compromise. Are they willing to go to war? I think a lot of these questions, I mean, based on my own dealings with the Chinese scholars and experts and government officials over the past decade, is that they're still just, what we're seeing right now, again, I'll do this again, 50 shades of gray zone, right? So on one hand, China is using militia forces to intimidate other countries. Sometimes they send, energy exploration rigs to the area, especially vis-a-vis the Vietnamese in the other parts of the South China Sea, towards the Paracels, for instance, or closer to the Vietnamese easy. Sometimes the Chinese send a warship. And sometimes they have what they call cabbage strategy, whereby you have a militia on the front, and then there's a Coast Guard behind, and then just over the horizon is a Chinese naval warship to tell you, we got escalation domination. You mess with our militia, you mess with our Coast Guard, we're going to come in. But of course, what further complicates is that the Philippines, unlike any of the countries who are in this dispute, Vietnam, Malaysia, and even Brunei, by the way, they're not very, vocal about it. The Philippines has a treaty alliance with the United States. So what suddenly makes this potentially more explosive is that the Americans, under the Mutual Defense Treaty, have made it clear, at least since the first Trump administration, that any attack on Filipino troops, on Filipino vessels, warships, public vessels, and Filipino aircrafts will automatically activate the Mutual Defense Treaty. So let's say, for example, the Sandy Cay. If Filipinos have warships in the area and troops, and for some reason the Chinese try to force their way, and some Filipino servicemen or Coast Guard or naval officials are killed or heavily injured, it might be a basis or ground for activation of the Mutual Defense Treaty with Americans. Obviously, the Mutual Defense Treaty is not a mutual offense treaty, but it could mean that the Americans will have to be involved in one way or another operationally. So now suddenly you have a situation whereby China is not only looking at, smaller Philippines, it is also have to take into consideration, will the Americans get involved depending on the severity of a potential violent confrontation?
And let's just put that, let's just ask that question then, because Pete Hegseth, who is the US Defense Secretary, was in Manila in the Philippines just a few weeks ago, and he appeared to be saying that the US will come alongside partners and allies. We've got a SOT from him, so a little bit of what he was saying at the time. Let's listen to that, and I would just like to get your reaction to it.
There's a long line of countries in the past who have attempted to test US resolve. We are resolved at this time, at this moment, to work with our partners to reestablish the warrior ethos, to rebuild our military and reestablish deterrence, and come alongside our allies and partners, first and foremost, in this region.
So my question then, Richard, is do you think the Philippines really believes that the US will honour that commitment under the new Trump administration? Will they still be as bold and as supportive as they have been before?
So again, very quickly, just for context. So during the Nixon-Kissinger era, the reason I mentioned Kissinger is because we know this from the classified material. Henry Kissinger in the 1970s, his primary worry was that the Filipinos would drag the Americans into a war over these disputed land features. So the 70s, this is the Cold War period. The U.S. is trying to improve its relations with China. The Indo-China wars are entering a new heated situation. And the Philippines back then, under Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the father of the current Filipino president, actually was boasting one of the most advanced weapon systems and militaries in the region in the 70s. So we were kind of like the little bully, to be honest about it, if you look at the facts on the ground. And we built one of the first, if not the first, modern air base in the area, which is where the Pag-asa Tito Island, you can see it still now. That goes back all the way to the 1970s. So Henry Kissinger's worry was this, that the Filipinos will leverage the Mutual Defense Treaty to go for what Kissinger called self-aggrandizement moves, right? So what the Americans did was to come up with this so-called doctrine of strategic ambiguity, to say, yes, we are with the Philippines if there's an attack on them by a third party, but they never specified, where. For instance, they said in the Pacific. And then, of course, they also made it clear in multiple cables and in different ways talking to the Filipino officials that what you got, you stick to that, but don't drag us into getting other disputed land features, right? Because by this time, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, everyone was making a move. Now, that strategic ambiguity position was adopted all the way to President Barack Obama. So when Obama was in Manila 2014, we signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This is just 2 years after Philippines and China have a naval showdown over the Scarborough Shoal. Philippines eventually was forced to cede that area to China because China just sent the whole armada there. And while we had to withdraw, we felt betrayed. We felt there was like, we were hoodwinked and the Americans were not there for us. But you see, we gave Americans more access so that they'll be more helpful to us and that we have more assurances. But Obama, when he was here in Manila in 2014, he said, oh, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. He literally used the term bunch of rocks. And to make the insult more, more poignant, he even said, we have disputes with Canada, right? But we don't go to war with Canada over, rocks or something like that. So you could see that strategic ambiguity was holding all the way to the Obama administration. There was tremendous amount of disappointment. In fact, that's exactly why when Philippines elected someone named Rodrigo Duterte, I suppose folks are familiar with that person, he immediately seized on that and said, oh, last time I checked, the Americans are not very reliable partner. But by 2019, Secretary Mike Pompeo, back then the U.S. Secretary of State, visited Manila shortly after the Kim Jong-un Trump's second meeting in Hanoi. And in a press conference and in public, he said any attack on Filipino troops, servicemen, public vessels, and aircraft in the South China Sea, so he was very specific about that, will activate the Mutual Defense Treaty. In fact, in 2019, in June or July, there was this incident in Reed Bank and other disputed territories when a Filipino fishing vessel was rammed by an alleged Chinese militia vessel. And back then, Sung Kim, the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, said even gray zone attacks by Chinese militia could be a ground for activation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So you see this dramatic departure from decades-long ambiguity towards more strategic reassurance.
So what about now then? Do you believe that that is still in play?
So Biden basically adopted that. So Filipinos were like, okay, maybe Democrats are not as dovish as we thought. So we're generally fine with Biden. In fact, under the Biden administration, we further strengthened our cooperation with Americans, including giving them 4 new ETCA facilities, thereby Americans even having more presence in the Philippines and even deploying the Typhoon missile system, among others. And then comes the second Trump administration. Interestingly, when Hegseth was in Manila, I was in Brussels, having conversation with think tanks and experts and officials there about your situation in Europe. And I know very well you have your issues with the second Trump administration. I don't think you need to watch J.D. Vance's speech or his meeting with, Alternative for Deutschland. We know it, that in Europe, you have a very complicated relationship with the second Trump administration. In the Middle East, countries are also looking at potential changes, including vis-a-vis Iran, etc. But here actually in Asia, particularly in the case of the Philippines, what's interesting is that you never hear from any top Trump official saying the Philippines is not spending enough. Last time I checked, for instance, Elbridge Colby, who's the number 3 in the Pentagon right now, saying, you in NATO should spend 5% of your GDP, the Taiwan is 10%, Japan is 3%. They never said anything about that vis-a-vis the Philippines. The sense in the second Trump administration, I don't know about Trump, he hasn't said much, but as far as all his officials, key officials are concerned, is that there's an element of what I call strategic sympathy, which is, the Philippines may not have as much resources as you Europeans or the Japanese or even Taiwanese, but with the limited resources we have, we're really punching way above our weight. We took the Chinese to court in 2013 and won the case in 2016, and we paid the price for that. We got pressure, we got sanctions, we got all sorts of pressure and risk. Now, despite the fact that we don't have a big Navy, our Philippine Coast Guard, and to a lesser degree also our naval forces, are at the forefront of what we call a transparency initiative, exposing what we see as bullying and illegal activities by China. And Philippines is practically the only country in ASEAN nowadays, no offense to Vietnam, which is openly calling out China and saying what they're doing is wrong and asking the international community to also censure China. So what I see with the Trump administration so far is this. They're not demanding the way they're demanding vis-a-vis you guys. And there's at least an appreciation that despite our limitations, we're doing the most we can. In fact, we are kind of an important frontline state because the Philippines is not only important on the South China Sea question, we're also important on the Taiwan question.
Yeah.
So in short, there are ties that bind and there's strategic sympathy. So weirdly, the second Trump administration is not creating much worry. If anything, people are quite happy with how the second Trump administration is treating the Philippines on this question.
Very interesting.
Very
we're going to talk about Taiwan in a moment because we have Melissa Chan join us. Did you have a quick question? Because I wanted to just talk about the drills that are going on.
Yeah,
But
well,
if you-
actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. There's a lot of chat in our chat who are wondering basically which came first, the drills or the Chinese attempt to make its presence known on that rock. So Memovox says, what's Richard's position on the U.S. military presence? And let's see. And then there was a direct response to that. Hijo de Sol de Oriente said, show U.S. military bases and presence as if these bases weren't welcomed by the nation they're in. We want them here. That's the difference with China. So in other words, a lot of Filipinos support the idea of a military presence around there because they feel like it's protecting them from China. So I guess my question to you is, to what extent do you see the possibility for an escalation or a de-escalation here? If the Trump regime wants to show its strength against China by doing military exercises, which it has been doing for the past few weeks,
we can show
and
some of those
ramping that
pictures
up,
actually, just as we're talking.
Is that sending the signal to China that they need to be on the watch for the U.S. trying to take away some of the legal or illegal gains that they've made in the past few years? In other words, is that an escalation, and is there a way to actually de-escalate with China here? We're seeing images of U.S. Filipino drills.
Yeah, these are in the northern Philippines. They were filmed just hours after China said it had seized control of Sandy Cay, so that rock that we were talking about. That's what we're looking at the moment.
This live fire started just hours after the picture on Sandy Cay, but the drills had been going on for since mid-April, I believe, or even early April, I think.
Late April until, I think 2 weeks from now or something like that, around May 8, 9, 10. So this is almost a 3-week-long or 2.5-week-long exercises. Just to be clear again, these exercises were planned last year during the previous iteration of this massive U.S.-Philippine exercises. This year is almost as big as last year, around 11,000 American troops, 6,000 Filipino troops, 5,000 to 6,000. The Japanese are also there, going to be directly participating. They have signed the Visiting Forces Agreement style agreement with us, the Reciprocal Access Agreement, and the Australians. And interestingly, this year, there are 4 new European countries who are going to be observers: the Netherlands, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, of course, another very important country. Sikorsky, former Mr. Sikorsky, was in Manila a few months ago. We had conversations also. Poland, Philippines have a strong relationship. Well, so first of all, these exercises were not planned like yesterday. They were planned last year. But January earlier this year, that's like the last part of the preparation part. That means the Trump administration still had a say. It's not like this was planned during Biden last year and then we just went with the menu that Biden provided us. No, the Trump administration still cleared more or less things that were laid down during the Biden administration. So clearly you see a continuity. This year is interesting because you have full-scale war scenarios, including the sinking of a World War II Filipino corvette involved. You have Philippines later on, I think this is around May 7 or 8, Philippines using the newly acquired BrahMos missile system from India, and the Americans using the NMESIS cruise missile systems also to coordinate their missile coordination interoperability. And then at the background, interestingly, the Americans finally cleared a $5 billion F-16 fighter deal with the Philippines, which has been under discussion since ever. I remember writing about this issue. And also, even more importantly, the Americans indicated that they may deploy a second Typhoon mid-range capability missile system, if not to the Philippines, at least to Guam or to the region. Now, when you put all of these things together, it looks like the Trump administration is invested in the Philippines, sees the Philippines important. If anything, we might even see further escalation in cooperation between Philippines and U.S. as a way to, as Hexet put it, to deter China. Because the idea is very simple. You know, if you are weak, you invite aggression, right? If you have strength and capability, whether on your own or in coordination with your allies and friends, you project strength, you make the other side think twice. So I read this, the reason why we had, you know, the Scarborough Shoal incident in 2012 and other kind of setbacks for the Philippines is because neither the Philippines had the capability on its own, nor was the U.S. reliable. And the basic idea here is that if the U.S. doubles down in its cooperation with the Philippines while the Philippines strengthens its own capability, then maybe China will think twice. No one is under an illusion that we can match China ship to ship and renminbi to renminbi. But if we have minimal deterrence capability, maybe it will make the Chinese think twice. Like, good example is last year we had a lot of back and forth with the Chinese. At some point, a Filipino naval serviceman even lost his finger after there was a skirmish and melee near the second Thomas Shoal, another hotly disputed territory. But eventually the Chinese had to settle for some sort of understanding, right? And the understanding was they're not going to interrupt Filipino resupply missions to that area, because the Americans made it clear, because there are Filipino troops there, if those troops get hurt, not just losing a finger, but get killed or shot at, then the Americans are eventually going to come in. And my sense is, again, Trump is not the most reliable partner, perhaps, to you Europeans or to some Middle Eastern countries. But here in Asia, there's a sense that the U.S. is invested in helping frontline allies because it sees China as its true peer and at the same time true competitor for hegemony or dominance in the world.
Thank you, Richard. I just want you to pause there, just to remind everyone that we are discussing or looking at the South China Sea and asking, from Taiwan to the Philippines, is China making its move while the world is distracted? We have got Richard Heydarian with us in Manila, who has been fascinating, Richard, with all that information. But I'd like now to bring in our East Asia correspondent, Melissa Chan, who joins us now from Taipei. Melissa, it's great to see you. We miss you sitting around this desk, by the way, because normally you would be here in the studio with us. But it's great to see you there in Taipei. Just thinking now about what Richard was saying, and particularly with the discussion we were having about Sandy Cay, so this rock in the middle of the South China Sea that China unfurled this flag on. Does all of this make Taiwan feel more nervous, given the situation it is in with China?
One-word answer is yes. I will also say that to comment on Richard's fantastic explanation just now, where he has been explaining that Asia feels reassured, I think it might be more accurate to say that the Philippines feels slightly okay with the situation right now. But I can say that from Taipei, people are a little bit more nervous. And part of it has to do with the incrementalism of the way that the Chinese are operating in the Indo-Pacific, and especially with the Philippines, taking it step by step. Richard had said earlier how dismissive the language was from former President Barack Obama, calling it a rock. Unfortunately, a part of the challenge of the American leadership is that they will have to explain to American citizens why, if they do decide to get involved in an engagement of some kind, why they are doing so. And the fact of the matter is when you look at the visuals, Sandy Cay, for example, is indeed not a rock, not an island. It looks like a sheen of sand floating atop the Pacific Ocean. And so part of the issue is, and I think that is the understanding and view in Taiwan, is the understanding that American citizens over the last 20 years, particularly the generation of the post 9/11 period, is a little tired of American adventurism that they saw in terms of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the Taiwanese are making the assessment that, yes, there is this strategic ambiguity, but when push comes to shove, will the Americans back Taiwan up? And what they see with China is this incrementalism. They do something small enough that it would be really hard for a U.S. leader to justify to their citizens, yes, we need to come in hard and stop the Chinese. You do and make changes little by little, and eventually you change the facts on the ground. And that is the situation that we've seen in Taiwan, where, Chinese aggression, military exercises in and around this region has kind of fallen off the news cycle, right? In the very beginning, when China was a bit more assertive in this region, that made headlines, but these days it just doesn't. And that is a point of concern for the national security folks here.
And let's just pick up on that, what you were saying there about what Trump had said, Melissa. We know that Joe Biden had made it very clear that the US would defend Taiwan. And Donald Trump appears to be much less steadfast on that. We can listen to a little bit of what he said in February the 26th, where he was asked to comment on Taiwan and that China should never take Taiwan by force. And this is what he said. Let's just have a listen.
Is it also your policy that as long as you're president, China will never take Taiwan by force?
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. And if I said it, I certainly wouldn't be saying it to you. I'd be saying it to other people, maybe people around this table, and very specific people around this table. So I don't want to put myself in that position. The relationship we'll have with China will be a very good one. I see all of these phony reports that we don't want their money, we don't want anything to do with them. That's wrong. We're going to have a good relationship with China.
So how did those comments make Taiwan feel, Melissa?
Well, I think you can read it two ways. One is actually that President Trump actually did not depart that at all from U.S. policy of several presidents before him, bipartisan in terms of the policy that Richard was talking about, which is this strategic ambiguity. Why should you say what you intend to do? And in fact, it was out of the norm when President Biden did make his statements not once but twice, at least 3 times, that the United States would get involved. That was actually a departure from prior U.S. policy. And so if you were looking at it from the standpoint of a policymaker, you would say that actually what Trump said is back to what previous American presidents had said. You just don't know what the United States will do. So Beijing, you better think twice before you do anything because you just don't know what the response will be. But on the other hand, I want to underscore something, which is that it's very clear that this American president is an emotional president in the sense that he has his favorites, he has the countries he likes, and he has the countries he does not like as much. He likes big countries, right? Big Russia, big China. Those are countries that he admires, even if he views them as competitors in some circumstances. And he has, when you look at how he views Ukraine, found the smaller country, the opposition country, a nuisance. And he has made statements in the past on Taiwan, accusing Taiwan of essentially stealing American know-how in order to be at the forefront of the semiconductor industry in the world. That is a false accusation, by the way. And so that is the other part of the puzzle in terms of there is a sense that this U.S. president doesn't like Taiwan, and that will matter and that will play a role in things. And I found what Richard had to say very interesting. Indeed, this current president has not made much or any comments on the Philippines. And below him, those in the Pentagon have continued with their commitment with the Philippines. And that's just, that's not quite the situation that Taiwan is facing.
Richard, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I was based in Taiwan in 2019. I was based at National Cheng's University. I was a Taiwan fellow back then. And I remember very well, Taiwanese were worried that the Democrat would win, and they wanted Trump to stay. I mean, if you remember Trump 1.0, that was the administration that was really pushing the envelope in terms of engagement with the Taiwanese. Even at some point, Secretary Pompeo back then was indicating he may visit Taiwan after all. So to be fair to Biden, I think at least 4 times, he almost mistakenly said or implied that there was a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, which is no longer the case. But in fairness to Biden, before Biden did the Biden thing, which is speak out of, off the script, the Trump administration was already flirting with changing the dynamics of the relationship. So I remember very well, there was a sense of panic when Trump was losing or when he lost, and we're like, oh my God, what's going to happen to these Democrats? They're softies, they're dovish, they're going to be, and then suddenly, oh no, Biden is not too bad. And then now in Trump 2.0, we're seeing a very different dynamic. And in fact, this Trump is sounding different from the other Trump. And I'm sure there's a lot of internal explanations for that. The MAGA base is much bigger, much different. There's the isolationist wing in America, whatever you want to call it. The J.D. Vances of this world are much more vocal in ways that we didn't have it during Trump 1.0 when veterans were really the adults in the room were calling the shot. But again, let me get back to this. So first of all, with Taiwan, it's an interesting reversal in terms of their feelings towards Trump, because I remember very well how things were different back in 2019. But again, my read is that, and you hear this from Elbridge Colby, among other folks who are very influential in shaping policy in Pentagon, their idea is that Taiwan is a very wealthy country. Taiwan is facing one of the biggest, if not the second most powerful country in the world. They're not doing enough. They're not spending enough on their military. There are a lot of jokes by a lot of countries about Taiwanese, I don't know, military training, supposedly. Basically, the position I see, not only from Trump, but top officials, push the Taiwanese to spend more, buy American weapons, but more importantly, go for, mass conscription and get them to do serious, scary training for all-out war. So that's why I think it makes sense for Trump, not for us, but for Trump, to give a bit of tough love to Taiwan because they feel that Taiwan has been coddled too long or that Taiwan is not doing enough, which is the difference with the Philippines. We're not as wealthy as Taiwan. We don't have the technological capacity, but despite our limitation, look at how much we're helpful, at least to America's understanding of a rules-based order in the region. But let's not forget, the Taiwan issue is not just between Taiwan, US, and China. Inevitably, Japan and the Philippines are going to be involved. And as we speak, and this strategy was already emerging under Biden, is what they call the integrated deterrent strategy, whereby, basically you have Okinawa, Guam, and northern Philippines forming a triangle together with Taiwan. If you put enough missile systems and pre-position enough good weapon systems there, you may deter China from even deciding to invade Taiwan. And, Melissa correctly was saying there's a lot of incrementalism, but I would say it's an accelerated incrementalism. Even the incrementalism of China is 50 shades, right? We're seeing a darker shade of that, whereby since Nancy Pelosi's visit a few years ago to Taiwan, you see China conducting this scary, multi-domain, sophisticated operation. The latest one they had a few weeks ago was basically showing to Taiwan, we can choke you off and completely put you under siege. And the Chinese Navy is really massively developing. And Xi Jinping made it clear, by 2027, not invade Taiwan, but be in a position to successfully conduct a potential invasion of Taiwan. That's very important. He never said by 2027, we're going to invade Taiwan. That's not the Davidson window is a myth. But having said that, that's where the Philippines suddenly is even more important to the U.S. because it's not only about pushing back against China in dominating the South China Sea. If we allow the Americans to preposition multiple Typhoon battery systems, more and more American troops in bases closer and closer, from here, Manila to Kaohsiung, within an hour, actually, you can even make it to Taiwan. That's how close Philippines is to Taiwan. We're closer to Taiwan than most Southeast Asian countries, if not all Southeast Asian capitals. So what happens in northern Philippines will shape what China does vis-a-vis Taiwan. And what I'm saying again here, it's not charity towards the Philippines. It's a recognition and our leveraging of that dual importance, both on the South China Sea front, but more importantly on the Taiwan question.
Melissa, just want to pick up on a couple of things.
And I should just add.
Yes, go ahead. You add, because I wanted to pick up on that idea of the tough love, and that's what Trump was trying to show Taiwan. And given that we've just mentioned that date of 2027 when President Xi had told his army to be ready for a conflict with the US, possibly over Taiwan, not necessarily, as Richard points out, invading. But just what is the feeling in Taiwan about those issues, the tough love? They need to do more. They need to show more that they have their own capacity to discourage China.
Yeah, it's very enjoyable to be in conversation with Richard because he's so knowledgeable. He's absolutely right about Taiwan not being prepared enough. They are buying the weapons, but you need more than that, right? It is a whole of society effort. The military requirements, the mandatory military service was up until very recently only for 3 months. What can you possibly learn in 3 months? And there were lots of reports of young Taiwanese men exiting the program saying that they didn't really know how to do anything. Basic first aid, how to apply a tourniquet, which is extremely important, if there is indeed a war. And so the need to advance that and make the citizens prepared in a way that, that the South Korean mandatory military service does prepare and does train its male population properly. And so, yes, indeed, there is a lot of tough love. And what I would say is that there is a disconnect between national security folks in Taipei and what the rest of the population and, frankly, the vast majority of the politicians are able to really push through and commit to. This is an island that should be as prepared as Israel or Finland, the Baltics, in terms of mitigation and defense, and it is not there. And some of the politicians know that and say so, but certainly as a country, it is not. So going back to what Richard was saying about Xi Jinping and the military being ready, I think is the main thing to keep in mind by 2027. Indeed, I think the main thing is there has been a sort of a clouding of that year, right? Many people thinking that that means invasion. No, it means being ready. But being ready, it should be setting off alarms enough. And I think it's very important to take leaders, especially leaders of authoritarian countries, at their word. They are less answerable to their populations. Perhaps if you were a political leader in a democratic country, you might make statement A one day, and then due to constituent response, unhappiness within the public, you might actually pivot and do a 180 and make a statement B sort of policy change. We in fact kind of even see that with the Trump administration in many ways, getting negative feedback and then modifying some of his more chaotic decisions. But with General Secretary Xi Jinping, he has said this, and I think that we need to take that very seriously in terms of the readiness, and Taiwan needs to take that seriously. And again, underscoring the fact that some people in Taiwan realize this, but a lot of others don't. And I should also, I don't want to get into the weeds of this too much, but it might be interesting for people tuning in to know that, Taiwan's domestic politics is an absolute mess right now. Maybe not quite as bad as the United States or South Korea, but kind of getting there. It is very partisan. It is a very locked legislature. There are recall election or movements right now to take legislators down from both sides of the two major parties, and so that also is a hindrance for the ability of the government to properly prepare their defenses.
Thank you.
I wanted to just read a few questions that we've gotten in the chat, because I think a lot of people are trying to grapple with what are the alliances in the South China Sea, in that area of the world. They're trying to just really figure out what are the differences between the countries here. So Glenn Defender said, what would it take for the USA, Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan to form a strategic partnership focused on defense? So putting them all into a group of countries that have some interest in defending against China. DeVos said, I'm just not sure Trump would use U.S. military to help Taiwan or any other nation in the region. Hooves Q says, if Taiwan happens, meaning I'm assuming the China reclaiming Taiwan militarily, what countries would side with China? In other words, do nothing. And Jonas Smart says, nobody will come, and this is an all in caps, nobody will come to Taiwan aid. I say it again, no one will come to Taiwan military aid. So
I mean, the rules are if it's in all caps, you need to scream it.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But there's no exclamation mark, so I didn't. But the question here, the question I'm kind of trying to discern from all of this is that not every country in Asia is the same in the eyes of the U.S., right? The U.S. has strategic interests there. China has strategic interests there. All the countries there have their own strategic interests. But if you look at a country like Taiwan, the U.S. has explicitly never made a defense contract with Taiwan, which puts it on very different footing from the Philippines, which has this mutual defense treaty. So when we talk about the U.S. involvement in sovereignty of the states of Asia, we're talking about two very different stories when we talk about Taiwan and the Philippines. So I think we just need to tease out the differences here, and we can't put it all in the same bucket.
I would just say, it is weird. Let us all acknowledge that it is weird because the United States is viewed as Taiwan's best bet as a security guarantor, yet they do not have diplomatic relations, right? In fact, Taiwan doesn't have diplomatic relations with any of the countries that you mentioned, and that is the strange thing. Nevertheless, it is, I think, the 13th or 16th, depending on the year, largest economy in the world. And you mentioned South Korea at the very top in terms of one of the comments in terms of forming alliances. Why would South Korea, why would Seoul do that? They trade with China. Japan trades a lot with China, a lot. there's a lot of economic interdependence there that they would not want to be in a situation where they would piss off Beijing. And in fact, Seoul kind of did. And I know this, Richard would probably be, as a defense expert, know a lot more about this, but quite a number of years ago, not too long ago, but, you know, the missiles that were installed in South Korea really pissed off the Chinese. They were ostensibly for the North Koreans, but the way the THAAD missiles, yes, and so like the way Beijing responded, I don't think people fully understand. They went after Lotte, which I think most people know it as a snack company in the United States if they're lucky, but it's a chaebol. It's a massive company, just completely got locked out of the China market as a way of punishing the South Koreans, and they learned their lessons. They don't like it. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of major South Korean and Japanese companies do a lot of trade with China. Now, the other thing I think I should mention is a little quick history thing, very briefly. Most likely, in terms of the nations that might be invested in Taiwan, is ironically Japan, because it colonized Taiwan and colonized it for a very long time. In fact, Taiwan might speak Mandarin and Chinese here as the predominant language, but you walk around, you spend enough time here, and culturally, I would say it's actually more Japanese than it is Chinese. And I'd be curious, Richard, your thoughts too, because I know you spent a year here. And so there is actually a lot of Japan has shown more concern over Taiwan than probably any other country in East Asia. But the question is whether it would really get involved if the Americans were not committed as well.
Well, I mean, first of all, the late Prime Minister Abe made it clear that Japan cannot be neutral in an event that something big happens in Taiwan. Remember, Taiwan is next to Okinawa. It's next to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And from the Japanese perspective, if there is something, you know, if China takes over Taiwan, then that directly threatens them in terms of their own concerns with China, whether in Okinawa or in Senkaku Diaoyu or in the East China Sea. With the Filipinos, we don't want to have communist China having a giant island to our north, right? Like a while ago, we were talking about how the Philippines is so worried about these tiny islets going to China. Now imagine what a horrific situation it would be for Filipino strategists if they're looking at China occupying Taiwan and staring down at northern Philippines, where, by the way, is where much of the industries and much of the economy, and, you know, Manila is not too far away, right? So a nightmare scenario for the Philippines would be that. But even before going there, and I've been part of like war games and simulations. Remember, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, have massive population of workers in Taiwan. I think there are like 400,000 Indonesians there, more than 250,000 Filipinos. So in the opening moments of a potential war, we would know if there will be a war. How? Because there will be indicators. China will be moving strategic resources. China will be stockpiling resources. There will be movement of officers. It will be a massive operation, maybe even more massive and satellite, you know, seeable than what Putin was about to do to Ukraine when no one was believing Biden and you know, the American information on that invasion. So going back to this, I mean, I keep on hearing, like, I remember very well, even days before Russia invaded, you know, Ukraine, I was there in Germany talking to folks at the Munich Secret Conference, and people couldn't believe it. Of course they won't do it. And, you know, Ukraine is not even a U.S. ally. It's nowhere close to Taiwan in terms of its importance. Taiwan produces 90% of the most high-end semiconductors that will run your most high-end civilian and military technology. So Taiwan is not just about a question of love or sentiment, although Melissa is right. Japan has a sentimental connection, and you can find a lot of elderly population in Taiwan who speak absolutely good Japanese. There's an affection towards Japan, Imperial Japan, that none of us have in the region. But what I'm saying here is that it will be a mess in a sense that some countries like Indonesia will just negotiate with the Chinese, get our people out, we'll say whatever you want, most likely, right? But for the Philippines, we're just next to Taiwan. Yeah. We have American military bases. We cannot tell that the Chinese will just follow you and go ahead and kill the Americans and will not do anything. We cannot do that. We cannot be neutral. So even though we have similar problems, meaning protecting our population, our responses will be structured completely differently. And as far as the Japanese concerned, Prime Minister Ishiba is here in Manila, or he just left Manila a few hours ago. And he was here to also discuss, like, how can we middle powers talk to each other? I mean, just like you Europeans trying to deal with the Ukrainian issue on your own as much as possible, we're also saying, hey, Japanese, Indians, Australians, let's talk to each other and figure out what are we going to do, and not just waiting and, you know, reading the tea leaves and like, where's Trump, what is his mood tomorrow morning or something like that. But all I can say is that below Trump, no one knows Trump's mind. I think Trump doesn't know his own mind, but below Trump, there is this understanding. Taiwan needs more tough love. Philippines should get more love. Japan has more to offer. And if we can put all of these countries together, you can have integrated deterrent strategy that will make China think twice. Remember, the big difference between China and Russia is that China is a status quo power. They don't have the kind of economic decline and demographic decline that Russia has been going through. China is the biggest winner of globalization. Their biggest export destination is no longer you guys or Americans, it's us in Southeast Asia. So so for China to invade Taiwan, it must be really a severely crazy scenario for that to happen. And that is why the real game right now is deterrence. What should we do so that China will never take seriously the prospect of having to invade Taiwan, and that this will be just a scenario rather than a reality? And that's where things are going to get complicated. Are we going to host more American weapon systems? Are there going to be more Americans in Okinawa? What are they going to put in Guam? So in short, I think the strategic picture is pretty clear. No one wants to war. Even China doesn't want war. But the tactics will shape the reality. Depending on what the little things in terms of military deployments and exercises and signaling, that could shape China's strategy and also American strategy on this. So my sense is...
Richard, yes. I just wanted to say, because I know that you... Please finish your sentence, but I'm very aware that you've stayed way over the time that we had agreed. So I feel like I should be letting you go very soon. But please, give us your last thought before you disappear.
Well, all I'm saying is that if there's one thing I learned from geopolitics over the past 10 years is that you never know, what's going to happen next. In a sense that, having fixed assumptions about what will happen if this happens, I think is foolish. What we know is that what you do today can shape what happens tomorrow. And what you do today is what the Philippines and the U.S. are going to talk about in terms of South China and Taiwan, what the Taiwanese and Americans are saying behind the scenes, what the Japanese are doing. In short, the future is not fixed. As far as geopolitical uncertainty is concerned, we're in a completely new era. But having said that, there are ties that bind. There are mutual defense treaties. There's an American interest in terms of hegemony in this part of the region. Taiwan is going to be your still #1 high-end semiconductor producer for the foreseeable future. And that means they're basically an extremely important country that if China gets, will change the whole ball game. And that do not forget also the strategic autonomy and the role of the smaller powers. I think it never helps us if we just talk about Trump, because, we can have a conversation forever. I think it's more important to pay attention to what the second-order powers are doing, Australia, Japan, even the Philippines to a certain degree. That will shape the reality, not only what the Trump administration will say. So if there's one thing that may come out of the second Trump administration is that it may be so shocking and so worrying that finally we'll all get, our acts together. And in the case of Taiwan, maybe they'll be a little bit more chill, right? Or actually less chill. I think the problem with our Taiwanese friends, I love their resilience. I love their culture, and Melissa is absolutely right. The bento, the Japanese culture is very, but sometimes I think they're a bit too chill. So the South Korean example is perfect. Koreans are also quite chill. If you go to Seoul, I've been to both North Korea and South Korea. They're quite chill, but they have the military conscription. They have a massive military, and South Korea has one of the most modern armed forces and most powerful defense industries. So maybe Taiwan can learn a little bit more than that, because the Koreans are facing North Korea, the Taiwanese are facing China.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much. I mean, you are a wealth of information, and we could probably just be listening to you for hours, but I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much. We've really enjoyed spending time with you. It's been very, very interesting, and we look forward to speaking to you again. Oh, wow, that's a cool picture. I love that. That was a cool goodbye, wasn't it? I'm out of here.
Move, yeah.
Just, Melissa, I want to come back to you, and I want, Clifford, we need to speak to you as well. Very briefly before we do that, the chat check. I'm just going to, I bet you
the
it's
chat
been...
has been very, very active today, and plenty of great... Amien, you've done a great job of actually sifting through a lot of the comments there that I've been putting into the chat, that we have a private chat where I send comments to Amien, and I've found...
Don't tell him about that.
Yeah, that's a secret.
No, well, I send a couple of... But there's been a lot of comments just asking questions. I think it was great that you did that, Amien, to sort of ask our guests to clarify a lot of those, about those alliances, because there seem to be a lot of questions about that in today's chat as well. Also a lot of concern with regards to just the whole situation there in the South China Sea. That's one feeling that I'm getting. Also great to see our regulars in there having plenty of chat together. So big shout out to them as always. And I can of course give you the final result of the poll.
But we're not doing that yet.
Not doing that quite
no,
yet?
You're
Okay.
going to hold on to that one.
Right, okay.
You always want to bring it in earlier. No, you're not allowed to.
I'm trying to get you guys to vote.
I know, so please keep voting because it's not closed.
How many
Or maybe it
votes
is
do we have
closed.
so far?
Oh, it is closed. It's closed, but you can wait for that.
Okay, not bad.
Just let me bring in Clifford. Melissa, I know you're still with us, but Clifford, you've been sitting very quietly and patiently listening to all that. It was
Richard
very
great.
interesting, particularly what he was saying about the relationship between...
Melissa's on the ground as well. It's just, this is so...
But I want to just talk a little bit about tariffs and Trump, and something that, everybody, the whole world has been impacted by, and the fact that Trump's behaviour empowered China, do you think, in that it has perhaps encouraged some of those countries within that region to look to China as a steady hand rather than to the US, which has appeared at times very chaotic?
I think this is, there's a couple of things happening. Tariffs have certainly changed things, but this whole process of building a military base on territory belonging to a key ally of the United States in Asia has been happening for years now, and that's very significant. And suddenly we're now in an era of hard power. You know, the days of soft power and alliances is looking a lot shakier now. I think China would certainly like to project itself as being a friend, not a friend because it doesn't do friendships, but of being a partner for various states and building this sort of Asia opposition to Western hegemony. It's coming out with all these languages. You know, he's been to places like Vietnam and to Indonesia, but it hasn't really, I don't really feel that it's gelled. I think people are still deeply suspicious of China, even despite the fact that there's fear about Trump. And also, as Richard was saying, there's a different thing in Asia. There's a different view of how Trump is viewed differently. Marco Rubio, for example, his Secretary of State, has been very pro-Taiwan. And that's another angle. I remember talking to people in Taiwan about that. They feel that. There's a lot of uncertainty, I think, at the moment. So instead of just of us being able to read, trying to read Trump's mind, as Richard mentioned as well, we need to focus on what is actually there now. And with Taiwan, there's still a lot of ambiguity, which ties in with the strategic ambiguity that's going on. A key factor here is that $3.3 trillion of trade passes through the South China Sea every year. And that's those are the kind of numbers that Trump understands. Yeah. And I think a lot of what he is doing is ultimately going to be about ensuring that isn't interrupted.
Melissa, just picking up on that then, do you think that China has been perhaps somewhat empowered by the Trump administration so far, particularly when we're talking about tariffs and trade?
Not use the word empowered, and I would actually say that Beijing is taking advantage of the situation as best it could. But one thing is, the analogy I say is they are making lemonade out of lemons, as in they themselves are also, let's not forget, being hurt in this trade war. I think there's a tendency to believe, and I think that is the case, that Beijing is most likely able to stick it out longer than the Americans, but it doesn't mean that they're not scarred. I thought it was very interesting what U.S. President Donald Trump said in his interview with ABC News, the American network, where he said, well, the Chinese are going to have to make things, sell things cheaper. I mean, a tariff, that is a tax. And there are discussions right now between the exporters, the manufacturers from out of China, right, with their products headed towards the United States. What's actually going to happen? Because the buyers are like big companies with a lot of leverage, like a lot of them, right? Of course, there's also medium and small-sized businesses, but I'm talking about the big picture. And we have a chain like Walmart and telling the manufacturer, actually, you know what? You need to lower your prices in order for us to be able to afford to pay the tariffs, right? So I think there are these negotiations going on between exporters and the buyers happening over the last few weeks. And it's not, you know, entirely a certainty that it's just the American consumer that's going to eat the costs. They will definitely eat some of the costs, but also the Chinese exporters and manufacturers. And that's a huge, huge part of China's economy. So I think that we have to understand it that way. So much focus was given, including from DW and from myself, right, to Chinese leader Xi Jinping's visit to Southeast Asia. But as Richard mentioned, the Japanese Prime Minister also visited the Philippines and also visited Vietnam. Hardly got any headlines, but you know, this just happened a few days ago, and that is also a very large economy in East Asia, making the rounds. So I think we need to put everything in that context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you very much for spending all that time with us. We really appreciate it. We'll let you go because I know it's very, very late. So we appreciate the extra staying up for us, and we'll speak to you very soon.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Please. Please do.
I just want to emphasize that we should never discount. We've been very analytical, and Richard is so knowledgeable with the defense stuff. But we should never discount the role of emotions in all of this. It sounds silly, but frankly, leaders are emotional people. Male leaders are actually quite emotional. Putin made a decision to invade Ukraine that has been very harmful to the Russian economy. So I think that we need to keep that in mind, that while there are a lot of practical considerations that would argue against a hasty decision in regards to Taiwan, that we can't put it off the table, that a leader like Secretary General Xi Jinping might be making an emotionally driven decision. And the fact of the matter is that the view from Beijing and the view from China, the People's Republic of China, is that Taiwan should be theirs. That is a very emotional thing, but we have seen in history throughout people making decisions based on that and not on logical reasoning.
Melissa, thank you very much. Very wise words there. Thank you very much, and we will speak to you soon. Clifford, if I could just come to you then, because we are clearly wrapping up now. There was much that we wanted to discuss also because China, it's not just about the South China Sea when it comes to China. It's bigger than that, isn't it? We were even talking earlier about these exercises that China held going towards Australia and New Zealand, where they had these live fire exercises back in February. So there's that side, the military side. There's also all this soft power. We've talked a little bit about trade. I mean, it is a big... They're on a big mission, aren't they, China? I mean, how would you sum it all up?
Well, in some ways, this is about Tianxia, everything under heaven. It's an old imperial concept that everything under heaven belongs to the emperor. And in some ways, China wants to... It is expansive. It always says it isn't expansive, but it is expansive in terms of it wants to match what its economic strength with political and diplomatic strength. It feels that's its right. It's time for China to step up. This is about the Asian century, the 21st century being the Asian century led by China. So these are big picture thoughts that I think are central to how the Communist Party leadership thinks and how Xi Jinping thinks. And that means that you're going to see things like the use of the Chinese word for Okinawa, mentions occasionally of even how China has claims on Vladivostok, and there's an awful lot of this going on right now, and these bases form a very, very effective way of enforcing power in a region which China sees very much as its own. Much as like the US with the Monroe Doctrine for the countries in Latin America. You see that it's a very similar thing. And so ultimately the US is really, if it wants to stay in Asia, I presume it realizes that it's going to have to step up beyond what Donald Trump says. So I think we are entering a new era of great power competition. And I think the South China Sea is going to be absolutely central to how that competition plays out. And whether it's a war or whether it's a trade war, an expanded trade war, we don't know. But it's certainly a new era.
Thank you very much, Clifford. And thank you for being with us throughout this conversation. The poll, let's just quickly get the results of that.
I'll do it very briefly. So our question was, is China taking advantage of a distracted US? I think I'd know which one you'd vote for. It says yes by expanding control, 44%. Yes by testing red lines, 24%. No change to Beijing's policies, 18%, and no, the US is still engaged, just 12%. So it was great to have everyone voting. And also, thanks for your comments. It was great, as always, that you were sending in all those questions and comments. So big nod to all those.
Thank you very much. But you've had lots of comments as well. But
yeah. Do you want me to wrap up some of the comments here? I have a nice little ending. Yeah, let me just do the last one. DeVos said, we're also doomer, including me. I have to remind myself that we still have time to make and be the change we want to see in the world.
Oh, that's a nice one. Thank you, DeVos. We can always rely on you. Thanks, everyone, very much for being with us throughout this stream. Been really illuminating. I think we could have continued talking for some time, but we all have our limits. So thank you very much.
And thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be back. You can check what we're going to talk about next week, about 24 hours before, on our community page. So do keep an eye on that, and hopefully we will see you then. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye-bye.